Let me begin by asking you about this court case that's coming up on Tuesday, the onus being on these 9 Egyptians. Your thoughts on the charges they could face?
Yes, the EU has said very clearly that they want to dismantle smuggling networks, and so there's been a rise of criminal and administrative sanctions or cases that have been started against those involved either in search and rescue missions or those involved in potential smuggling activities. The difficulty with these cases is that it often also concerns migrants themselves that have been trying to cross the Mediterranean or other parts of the globe, and where they have really struggled to find a way to cross and maybe are running out of financial means and somehow get involved or get drawn into these kind of smuggling networks. So it will be very difficult to make those kind of distinctions and also to gather evidence as to whether or not they were involved.
Yeah, because what are your hopes for finding out where the money went? Hundreds on board, and we're hearing tales each time of $4,500 paid, $5,000 paid for each one. So any idea if we'll be able to trace where that money has gone?
Well, indeed, there was a Europol annual report that came out a few months ago, which have been documenting how much money people pay these days. And some of these go up to 10,000 these days to cross the Mediterranean. I'm not a legal expert, so it's hard for me to see or to make claims as to how they will detect that money. But if there were 500 people on board, that's a really sizable sum and terrible development.
Yeah, and along with the 9 Egyptians that have been arrested so far, a dozen people in Pakistan have now been detained. Leela, Jacinto, tell us more about these arrests.
Well, first and foremost, Pakistan has observed a day of national mourning today because this is the extent of how the disaster has affected Pakistan. So there are more than a dozen arrests. They've taken place across Pakistan, but a lot of them have been in the city. The city is called Gujarat. It's in the Punjab province. And among the suspects, what Pakistani authorities say are 2 kingpins, one of whom was caught at Karachi airport, they say, on his way to Azerbaijan. Now, as you mentioned, initially when this disaster happened, Greek authorities said that the migrants had paid $4,000 per adult. But now some of the Pakistani families who have relatives missing are telling Pakistani media that the price was $8,000 per adult. Now, this is an enormous sum of money in a country like Pakistan.
We don't know how many people were on board, but perhaps between 450 and 700. I've seen estimates. How many of those might have been from Pakistan?
We don't have the exact figure. What we do have is 80 bodies have been recovered and 104 have survived. Definitely there are 12 Pakistani men, able-bodied men who are among the survivors. But there are families, and they are in certain clusters of Pakistan. There are basically 2 clusters, and they are typically villages and cities where a family can have many members missing. So these clusters, there's one cluster in the Kotli district. This is in Pakistan-administered Kashmir, where there are at least 28 families that have missing members, and in the city of Gujarat in central Punjab province, that around 50 families claim that they have missing members. And, part of the reason that the Pakistani authorities have of declaring this day of national mourning is, of course, in grief and in solidarity with the loss, but also to raise awareness because Pakistan is a transition point for this migrant crisis. And many Pakistanis are saying, one, this kind of money, these are not poor people. This kind of sums can only come up by middle class or young men who have been duped and will, be enslaved trying to pay this amount of money, which is a huge sum in Pakistan. And 2 is to also raise awareness of this crisis. Unlike in Egypt, where they can cross into Libya pretty quickly. there's a geographical border, a terrain border to cross. Why are so many Pakistanis taking this perilous route? Pakistan has a political crisis, it has an economic crisis, but they are not a country in war.
Hanne Beirens, your reaction to what Leela just pointed out, that, again, if these huge sums of money were being paid to come on board, what does that tell you about who the victims were?
Well, indeed, it's been a long-term concern already also in the EU that those who are able to come are those who come from middle-class families or, people who can afford these kinds of sums, because there's hardly any legal route anymore into Europe to ask asylum or protection. So this has really given oxygen to more and more criminal networks also along the Balkan route, for example, in Serbia, where we see one after the other criminal networks popping up, trying to provide support to those who want to enter into the EU. And so this is a grave concern that exists also amongst those who are still committed to the right of protection and think about what about the very vulnerable who also need protection.
The BBC was reporting, based on satellite tracking, that it appears as though this vessel was not moving, but may have been stationary for hours before it capsized. At the Migration Policy Institute, have you been able to find out more?
Well, unfortunately, we don't have any access to these kind of satellite imaging, but this is a situation that has emerged since 2019 when Operation Sophia, which was an EU-funded and coordinated search and rescue operation, was stopped. And since then, we have this very odd or almost perverse situation where the Frontex operation rooms there, they can observe in real time what happens to ships, but they no longer have authority or a mandate to intervene themselves, so they have to notify the Greek authorities, which Frontex has clearly done. And hence the question is really what has happened, because ultimately the principle of the duty to rescue those in distress at sea is a fundamental principle of international maritime law. And the question is what has happened as a result of that.
Does the story of the Greek authorities seem consistent?
Well, the BBC investigation suggests that there are huge questions that can be raised as to the claims that have been made by the Greek authorities that this was a boat that was not in distress. That's a big question mark we have to ask, and the question is whether we will ever know what has really happened there. But the duty, the international duty, is quite clear, and hence the fact that that boat was there and when it started sinking that no actions were taken to save them is really problematic. And the UN is now asking for an investigation into that.
Hanne Beirens of the Migration Policy Institute, many thanks for speaking with us here on France 24.
Thank you.
I want to thank as well Leela, Jacinto.